right. Hello, how's it going? We're gonna get started. If you didn't check your name on the attendance sheet on the way in, please do that at some point before the end of our session. And welcome to week 3 of our Excel series. Anybody who's not been here the last couple weeks, anybody new? Okay, welcome. The way that these sessions work is they're going to be pretty hands-on. So I've got a link right here that you can go to, and that'll get you to our little tutorial we'll walk through today. Same content that's on the slides, just so you can follow along. And that's also where you can grab our data set for today. For those of you who were here last week, we're going to be using the same data set we were using last week. So up to you if you want to either download a fresh copy to use today, or if you still have the one from last week, that should work as well. Okay, cool. So today we are going to be taking a little bit of a detour from our last 2 sessions where we talked a lot about formulas, and we're going to be focusing a little bit more today on charts and tables. We are still going to be using a little bit of formulas, especially in the static charts, which we're going to do first. So that's going to sort of double as a little bit of a review of our last couple weeks. Cool. All right, so as a reminder, last week we spent a lot of time talking about a formula called XLOOKUP. So we are going to do a little bit of review of that today. And then we're going to mainly work on creating and customizing various charts and tables. And the data source that we're using, same one as last week, is about our fictional podcast network. All right, so we are putting ourselves in the shoes of a data analyst who works with a few hundred different podcasts. We have a bunch of information about those podcasts, including some of the advertising campaigns that they're running. And so that's the data set that we're going to use today. All right, so I'm going to run through a little exercise. We ran out of time to do this one last week, but I think it's actually kind of perfect because it's kind of a good review of all of the formulas that we talked about. So some of the types of formulas that we've talked about so far as a refresher include row-based formulas. So formulas kind of going across, adding information about each row in our sheet. We've talked about summary formulas, which are going to kind of crunch down a bunch of rows into something like an average, a sum, a count, those types of things. And then we talked about XLOOKUP, which is matching information based on a certain key across multiple sheets. And then the very last thing that we talked about last week is cumulative formulas. This idea of a running total. How much is the sum? Maybe, for example, a sum kind of adding up over time to get you to a running. Okay. So we are going to just start with a little bit of a refresher. I'm going to pull up our data set. Welcome. I'm going to pull up our data set from last week. Let me do that. Okay, fabulous. And so whether you're opening this for the first time or just pulling up your one from last week, I have a few columns over on the side of our campaign participation sheet. All right, so you're going to see a few different tabs. I've added a few in here for demo purposes today. But if you want to follow along with me, you're in the same data set. And then you're going to go in the sheets to campaign participation, which should be the third. All right, now we did some of this work, these columns, in our last session. I'm just going to hide these for now so that they're a little bit out of our way. And use these to do a little bit of review. All right, so our very first task is to, well, I guess I should start the other way. So our overall task, what we're trying to do is figure out how much revenue have all of our podcasts been making. All right, how much revenue have all of our podcasts been making? So on this sheet, we have information about which shows. So from our show ID, each of those numbers corresponds to a specific show. Which of those shows have participated in which advertising campaigns? All right, so if we scroll down, you'll see there's a DoorDash campaign, there's a Hilton campaign, et cetera, right? Different companies that might advertise on podcasts like they advertise on radio or television or anywhere else. Okay. So we want to figure out how much money, how much revenue in total all of these shows made across all of these campaigns. So we need to combine a couple of different pieces of information to do that. And this is the kind of thing that XLOOKUP is quite powerful for. All right, so as a quick aside to explain how the math works, the only dollar amount listed on the sheet is the CPM. Okay, in advertising, that means cost per mil or cost per thousand. This is talking about the 1,000 times that someone hears or sees an ad. Okay, so what the advertiser is saying is DoorDash is saying for show number 60, we're going to pay this show $35.26 every time 1,000 people listen to our ad on their show. Okay, so in order to figure out how much money an individual show is going to make from this campaign, we need to figure out how many 1,000 downloads that show is going to do in that period of time. Okay, so for the purposes of this, to simplify, remove one variable, we're going to assume that all these campaigns are a month long. Okay, I'm going to assume that's pretty standard length, but we're going to assume all these campaigns are 1 month long. And if you notice in our shows tab over here, we have our show ID number, which is very helpful. And we also have our monthly downloads number. All right, so we have show ID and our monthly downloads. So how many downloads these shows get in a month. And then back over here on the same tab I was just on, we have our show ID and their CPM. All right, the way that we are going to get to revenue is to just kind of reverse engineer that CPM map. All right, so revenue is the cost per 1,000 downloads times the number of downloads divided by 1,000. All right, that's what's going to get us to. So first thing that we're going to do is bring our downloads number over into here, and then we're going to do our little formula to figure out our revenue. We can figure out our total revenue that way. And then we're going to do a quick review of our cumulative formula. So as we add each show to each campaign, how much revenue are we stacking up over time? All right, so if you want to follow along, you can join me in the little Your Formula Here box under our downloads column. All right, what we're going to do is put in our XLOOKUP formula. You're always going to start with your equal sign, equals XLOOKUP. Again, you should get a nice little handy pop-up. Anytime you're typing in a formula, that's going to give you a little reminder of what those values are. Excuse me. All right, so for XLOOKUP, you're going to need to give it 3 pieces of information. First thing is, what is the value that it should go look for? What's our key that we should go look for in our other data set? All right, in this case, the only piece of information that's useful to do that with is our show ID. All right, so I'm going to give it our show ID. All right, then I'm going to do a comma, then I'm going to do my second argument. Second argument is, where should I go look for my show ID? So where should I go try to match this show ID to? What column? I can tell it's asking for a column because it's asking me for an array instead of a value. All right, anytime it asks me for a value, that's going to be typically, I'm going to give it one cell of information. Anytime it asks me for an array, I'm going to give it an entire column of information. All right. So what column do I want to go find my show ID in? Luckily, this is pretty straightforward. It's just the column that houses all of the IDs of all of my shows. All right, I'm going to select the whole column by clicking on just the header here by the letter A, since this is my column A. And then I'm going to type in a comma. So up in my formula bar there, I've got C2, comma, shows A to A. All right, that's just the shorthand for the entire selection of that A column. And the third argument that I got to give it is my return array. All right, so what value should I return if I do find that show ID? What value from which of these columns should I return? In this case, I want the monthly downloads number because that's what I'm going to use for my calculation. So I'm going to grab the column that contains the monthly downloads, which for me is column F. All right, so what this is saying is, go look at what's in C2, which show ID is in C2. Find that show ID in column A, wherever it falls. And whichever row you find it in, say you find it right here, go grab the value from that same row in column F. All right, that's the mechanic of what we're doing here. All right, and then you can optionally, you can give it a little something to say if it doesn't find a value. For example, it looks like our data set's a little unclean here. This show is missing a monthly downloads number, right? It doesn't have anything. So it might be nice for me to put a little bit of text here that says something like show or no downloads listed, something like that, something sort of like human readable thing. The formula will throw an error, obviously, if it can't find an error or a 0 or something, if it can't find that there. But instead of assuming it means it's an actual 0, it can sometimes be helpful to put in a little message depending on what you're doing. So I'm going to do that here, parentheses, and I'm going to hit enter. All right, that's going to bounce me back to my tab where I was writing my formula. All right, and I'll see that it has got downloads is 138,719. All right, that's how many downloads this show gets in a month. I can kind of paste my formula down and see that it's grabbing different download numbers for each show. That makes sense. And I could always go gut check this as well, right? This is a good way to make sure you know that your formula is doing the right thing. The second row, for example, show 11 is saying it's got 196,000 downloads. I can go just check that with my eyeballs in this other sheet. Show 11, that's the same number, that matches. Cool. All right, so that gives me some confidence that my formula is doing what I want it to do. Okay, and I'm going to paste that all the way down. And an easy way to paste all the way down, I'm going to hover with my cursor over that lower corner. See, my cursor changes from a white plus sign to a dark plus sign. All right, when it changes to a dark plus sign, I can double click and it'll just paste all the way down nice and clean. Okay. All right. Okay, and I think this was actually not a good example of my error message because it did find all the show IDs. It's just that the downloads are in fact blank. So not the best demonstration of the error message, but the error message would show up if the show ID was not in here. For example, let's give it a crazy number. That will make my downloads show up. Okay, so that is our XLOOKUP formula, right? That's very similar to a bunch of the ways that we used it last week. Very common sort of way you might use this, especially to match on something that would always be unique, like an assigned ID number. Okay. All right, next we're gonna review just our little row-based math formulas. All right, so we gotta figure out revenue from our CPM and download. So this is even simpler. We don't need to use any formulas with any names. All right, I'm just going to start with my equal sign and type in the math here. All right, in this case, the math is, we want to take that CPM. So I'm just going to go over to D2 with my arrow keys, or I could have typed in D2 or clicked on it. All right, and then I'm going to say times number of downloads. So again, I'm just going to hop over to H2 as my number of downloads divided by 1,000. All right, I'm just going to close my these there. Great, and that is going to give me my total revenue. So this is how much money this podcast number 1, would make in 1 month at this CPM because it has this many downloads. All right, to make $5,000, a little over $5,000 based on their downloads. All right, same thing. I'm going to paste this all the way down. All right, and then this is where we start to see that having a 0 downloads number is a problem, right? Because if you have 0 downloads, you are making $0. All right. So if this were a real data set that I have, I would probably assume that those values were just missing, and I would maybe go, find a colleague, figure out how to get them filled in, right? I would assume that was maybe it would be an issue with the data, because typically, right, if an advertiser is buying an ad at this price on this show, the show exists, right? It would have downloads. So you can kind of use some context clues to figure out whether it's a data problem or whether it's a missing information problem. Okay. All right. So the last thing we want to figure out is our total revenue, right? How much money are we as a collective of all of these podcasts bringing in? There's a few different ways we can do that. But one way we can do that is to use a cumulative formula. Right, so this is what we were talking about last week, where we're grabbing that sort of running total. I think last week we talked about the cafe example, right? If you're running a cafe and you sell a $2 coffee and then you sell an order that's $6 total, and then you sell another $2 order, what's your running total? How much money have you made so far? So that's what we're going to do here. So for my cumulative total, I'm going to start up here by just doing a simple sum. So I'm going to do equals sum. And in this case, I'm going to grab my little range. All right, so I'm going to grab, in this case, these 2 cells right here, and I'm going to hit enter. The thing I'm going to do a little differently here is I'm going to sort of glue the top cell in place. All right, what does that mean? That means when I paste this formula down, I don't want to just keep adding 2 cells and then 2 cells and then 2 cells, right? Each time. In the next thing down, I want to add those 2 plus this third one, right? And the fourth one, I want to add those 3 plus the fourth one, right? I want that number to keep coming down. So in order to do that, I am going to use our absolute cell reference, which is where I'm going to put $ in front of my first cell. So where it says I2 up there in my formula bar, I'm going to put the $ before the I and the $ before the 2. That means that's the $ is signaling to Excel that it's going to keep that cell in place. It's always going to refer to I2 if those $ are there, even as I paste my formula further down. All right. So we see that didn't change our result here, but as I just start to paste it a little bit further down, let's take a look at what that does. Okay. So if we look at our next cell down, which is in row 4, we have equals sum $I, $2, right? That stayed the same. And the range is going to I4 instead of I3, right? So that value is sort of pasting down. This is what typically happens when you paste down in Excel, right? It happened here in our XLOOKUP. Row 3 is looking at cell C3, row 4 is looking at cell C4, etc. That's the default, right? It's going to follow the logic as you paste down unless you tell it not to with those $. Right? So it's sort of an intentional use of when you want to use those and when you don't. In this case, if we're taking a cumulative sum, this is how we would want to do it. So I'm going to take this all the way down here. All right, I'm going to take my sum all the way down. And if I go all the way down to the bottom, those numbers are going to get really big because there's a lot of shows on here. This is going to be a few $1 million worth of, all right, this is going to be $3.5 million. And we'll notice my last 2 values are the same here, right? Because it's just adding on zeros at the end. These are some more where I seem to be missing data. And because I'm missing data, my sum is the same. So this is my total. All right, this is how I get my total revenue made. All these ads across all these podcasts. Okay, I know that might have been a little bit of a fast review, but any questions about what we just did to get from our show and our CPM information over to our total revenue? Feeling okay? Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Cool. So like I said, we're going to move on to charts and tables. We're going to be dipping a little bit into formulas, so don't totally turn your formula brain off quite yet. But make sure you have either that data set open from last week or a copy of the data set from our tutorial. All right, so class today is kind of going to be divided into a few different sections. Our first section is we're going to talk about static tables and charts. And then in the second part of class, we're going to get into pivot tables and charts. All right, so what is a static table? This is a table that uses formulas to summarize a larger data set. So this should sound familiar from our summary formulas that we talked about 2 weeks ago. We actually created what I would call a few very simple kind of summary tables in week 1 in our Netflix project for anyone who's here, right? So this week, we're going to kind of take that similar idea, but we're going to add some more formulas to those tables to do a little bit more summarization. All right, so just in general, this is kind of some best practices for really any kind of data table. You always want to make sure that in a summary table like this, you have a clear header for every column. You want to make sure that your numbers are formatted well, right? So if it's currency, make sure there's a currency involved. If the values are very large, right, like the ones we were just looking at in the millions, you want to make sure there's comma separators visible. That helps the human eye just sort of read that. And if it's a thing that's doesn't exist in fractions, don't display decimals, right? Only display decimals when it makes sense. And then we talked about this a little bit in week 1, but there's some handy built-in functionality called format as table, which lets Excel kind of take care of a little bit of the visual detail of tables for you. All right. So with that in mind, we're going to create a summary table of our data set. We're going to summarize some information about all the shows in our network by category. Okay. So if you look at our data set that we have here on our shows sheet, we have a bunch of information about our show, who the host is, what their email is, title of the show, number of downloads, and category, right? Content category. True crime, business, sports, right? Whatever kind of podcasts you listen to. It seems like this network has a whole bunch of them. And so we want to know some things about those shows. We want to know how many shows do we as a network have in each category, and what's the average monthly downloads of shows in each category, right? So for each technology, education, sports, which shows tend to be bigger, and which areas do we have more shows? All right. So there's a few different ways we could do this. We could do this as a static table. We could do this as a pivot table. In this session today, we're going to do it both ways, so you can kind of see the pros cons of doing it both ways. All right. So first thing we are going to do is get a list of all of our unique categories. All right, the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a handy built-in tool to Excel called Remove Duplicates. So what you're going to want to do for this summary table is create a new sheet. So come down here and do a new sheet. I'm going to call mine something like demo. You could call yours something like summary. All right, and we are going to grab our shows. We're going to grab this entire category column, and we're going to paste a copy of it over into our new sheet. All right, so I'm just copy pasting all my category values over here. All right, so it should be like a couple hundred long. To form my summary table, right, I don't want these values repeated. I don't want it to say technology 50 times in here, right? I just want it to say technology once, and then I'll put a number next to it. So I'm going to select that column. I'm going to go in my ribbon up here to the data section of my ribbon. And then depending on how wide your window is, you may see this little tool that says remove duplicates, or you may just see the little blue boxes with the red X. All right, and mine, I guess it's not wide enough because I've got the blue boxes with the red X, all right, about halfway over on my toolbar. So I'm in my data ribbon, I'm over here, I'm going to hit remove duplicates. Then I'm going to get this little pop-up. All right, the pop-up is going to ask me whether my list has headers. It's sort of a trick question because your list should always have headers, as I mentioned before. I'm going to say, yes, my list has headers, and I want you to remove duplicates from the category column. Okay, so all this is going to do is it's going to say, I recognize that this category or this column is called category. I'm going to look at all those other values and remove the duplicates. All right, once I hit OK, it's going to give me a little summary of what it just did. It's going to say 489 duplicate values were found and removed. 11 unique values remain. That means there's 11 unique content categories across all of my. Okay, fantastic. Now it looks like it found a blank, which means that the category is blank on some of my shows. Depending on how I want to handle this, I could leave this in here, or I could just get rid of it and keep my list a little bit cleaner. Kind of depends on your context. Either one should work for this. All right, so now I've got a little list of my categories. So I've kind of got like the makings of my table here, right? I'm going to add a couple pieces of information to this table. So I'm going to put my headers in for those pieces of information. All right, I'm going to add my number of shows. Is some information that I'm going to fill in for each category. And then I'm going to add average monthly. All right, those are the two pieces of information. When I type in a header like this, if you want, you can double click in between your columns when you get the little double-sided arrow. If I double click, it'll sort of auto fit my column to whatever text is in there. Okay. So I'm going to do some formulas now to fill in these values so I'm not going to go manually count how many true crime shows there are. I'm going to use a formula for that. We are going to use a formula called count if, which I believe we talked about last week. The good news is you don't necessarily need to remember whether we talked about it last week or not, because as soon as you type in equals count if, right here, open parentheses, you'll see the arguments that this function needs. If you need a little bit more of a reminder of your what you want to see in your formula, you can come up to your view menu and hit formula builder, and that will give you our little handy view over on the side. I can pull up count if, and it's going to give me a little bit more detail about what that formula does. All right, just built in, kind of helpful. All right, so I'm going to come in here and do count if. what does my count if formula do? It takes in two pieces of information, and it's going to use that information to count the number of cells within a range that meet the given condition. All right. So it's going to take the range of cells where I want to count, and then it's going to take the criteria. All right. What number or expression or text should I match against my range? Right. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to go look for true prime in all of my shows, and I want it to return the count, right? So every time that the text in that column matches true prime, I want it to count 1. It's going to count 1, 2, 3, 4 as many times as it sees true prime. And this formula is going to return that total number to me. So for the range, what I'm going to give this formula is my entire column here from all my shows. All right, I'm going to do my comma. And then my criteria, what I'm looking for in that column is just each individual, my demo tab, is just then each individual value in my category summary table. All right, so I'm giving it a whole column to go look for, and then I'm telling it what specific thing to look for and count in that. All right, in this case, it's going to be this value true prime. Close my parentheses, and it's going to tell me that there's 44 shows. Bigger. All right, so I've got 44 true crime shows based on my count if. Same thing, I can paste this formula on down. And we see that in this row, right, it's doing count if, it's looking at that same shows column, H to H, but instead it's going to go look for the column in cell A3, which in this case is technology, right? It's going to go count all my technology shows, and it's pasted that all the way down. So it looks like I've actually got a pretty good spread, a bunch of different shows, a bunch of different categories. It's pretty balanced, right? Not too many that have a lot more than the others, although it looks like we're a little bit heavier on business. Okay. All right. Cool. Next up is our average monthly downloads. We're going to do a very similar thing. All right, for this formula, we're going to use average if. Right? Hop over here. Open up my average if. All right, an average if is going to take 3 pieces of information. All right, it's going to take a range and criteria very similar to what we just did. And then it's going to ask you what range should it take the average of. Now it can't take the average of text, right? So we need to give it the column for this last argument that contains the downloads, right? We want it to return the average of our monthly downloads. And so we want that column to be our third argument for our average range. All right. We just went through the count if formula, and this one's very similar. I'm going to have you guys try this one before I type it out. All right, so I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes. You can pop open your formula builder to see your average if. I'll leave my count if one up so you can see how this one works. All right, so go ahead and try that average if in the average monthly downloads. All right. We'll wait if you get stuck. Give everybody to try that. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at your sheet 1 column H. So what's in sheet 1? This is our shows tab. Where's our sheet 1? Yeah, so it looks like just with this very common issue, it looks like you selected column H in this sheet, which is all blank. So that's why it's not show 0. Yep. So just make sure that first one is looking at that showed sheet. Yep, and you can just hit enter on your keyboard. You don't even have to go back to that original one. There you go. So, yeah, no problem. Yeah, sometimes that clicking back is a little confusing. Yeah, you got it. No problem. Oh, yeah.
So you have to go early.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, yeah. So if you, yeah, if you go to, everything we're gonna cover today is in the tutorial for today. So if you go to this one and go to the week 3 button, there's all the content.
And week 4 is the last.
Yes, week 4. So it's not next week, it's the following. The
Oh,
20th.
all right, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. No
Thank you
problem.
so much.
Thanks so much. All right. Does anyone have their average if working? Anyone getting an error on their average if? Where are we at? Minute? All right, let's take a stab at it. Who's got at least a partial version? You got something?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
All right, that's fine. We'll start with that.
So I've taken yeah, average if
Average equals average if, open bracket.
I think I took the range I think I selected the entire category.
All right, great. So we're gonna go over to our shows, grab the entire category. Fabulous.
Yeah, comma.
Comma, great.
And then I selected one particular category.
Perfect. All right, so I'm in my demo thing. I'm just gonna go grab the same category in this row that I'm in.
Yeah.
Great.
And then I kind of took the number of shows together. I'm not sure. I think I made an error there.
Got it. Okay, yeah, so you did, but that's all good because you got us 2/3 of the way there. All right, so the last piece of information that we want to give this formula is our average range.
Yeah.
Meaning, what do we want to take the average of? In this case, and another little hint for these formulas, anytime you're giving it 2 ranges, those ranges should generally be the same length. Because what it's doing is it's gonna go look in the row of that first range and it's gonna go across the other one. So it needs it across for everything that it's doing, right? So I'm gonna need another column that's the same length as my shows column. So hint, it's probably something in my shows sheet. All right, that's a good like mental reminder for yourself. So if I were gonna go over to my shows sheet, I'm trying to end up with an average downloads, which column in this sheet is my best candidate? Which column in this sheet has
The monthly downloads.
monthly downloads? Perfect. All right, great. So I'm gonna grab my monthly downloads column. That's all I need. Close my bracket. And I've got my monthly downloads. All right, makes sense why we go over to the downloads and not the shows here.
Yeah.
All right, yeah. So anytime we're doing these if formulas, this is a really good reminder. Those ranges should be the same length. Yep, yep. Very good. And they should also be in the same sheet, right? So just a quick, if you're having an error, you're getting zeros, checking which sheet it's referring to and just double checking to your. All right, where is shows H? Does that actually have the info I want? Where is demo A2? Does that actually have the info I want, right? Just kind of going through and checking those things is super helpful. All right. Fabulous. So I'm going to paste this down. All right, and then I'm going to do one more thing here, which is I'm going to do a little bit of tidying up of this just visually. All right, so I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to select all my data and I'm going to format it as a table. All right, so it's a little tidier. So I've selected my whole table. I'm up in my home ribbon. And if you go about 2/3 of the way over, you have your format as table option. You can pick any fun little color combo you want. Maybe today I'll do yellow just for kicks. This little box is going to ask you if your table has headers. Of course, your table has headers because we've been adding headers the whole time, right? I'm going to hit OK. All right, great. And it's just going to do some nice little formatting for me. Now, it's not going to take care of all the formatting. So a couple of things I usually do are come and double click on all my column dividers to make all my columns sort of auto fit. Another thing I'm going to do here is take a look at my downloads numbers, right? There's two things going on here. One is they have a bunch of decimal places because they're a mathematical average, but there's not really a concept of a partial download. It's either downloaded or it's not, is sort of how we think of it for this use case. So I don't need these decimal points. So I'm going to select these here, just do a little formatting. I'm going to go back to my home ribbon, and I have these handy little decimal point moving icons right here in my number formatting. I'm just going to click that until I get back to a whole number. All right, again, just basing that on sort of the context that I'm using here. And since these numbers are consistently pretty large, they're hundreds of thousands, I'm also going to add my thousand separators. All right, so I'm going to add my comma. Let's forget that adds decimal places back in. So I'm going to scoot that back over. All right, so I'm just going to add my thousand separators so that these numbers are a little bit easier to read. All right, and then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little sorting. All right, I think I want to sort by monthly downloads. I think that's what I said in here. Yeah. So I'm just going to come in here to my monthly downloads and do a little sort. Okay. Again, because I did my format as table first, that's a little built in. Just kind of saves me a couple clicks to do my sorting. All right, any questions about how we got to this final table? Fabulous. Okay, so next we're gonna switch and talk about charts. All right, so typically your workflow for creating a chart is you're gonna create some sort of table first. You're gonna do whatever sort of summarizing of your data you wanna do in a table. This is a way that you can sort of like make sure it all looks right, etc. And then you can go ahead and insert your chart. All right, if you've ever used a chart in like PowerPoint or any of these services, all the options are basically the same, so that some of these may look familiar, but we'll just do a quick example. All right, so we're going to create a chart from our table. All right, the way to do that is you always have to start by selecting all the data in your table. All right, again, another little shortcut for doing this is just to click anywhere in my table and then do Command A. That's going to grab all my contiguous data there. I'm going to go into my insert ribbon at the top and I'm going to do insert chart. I don't find this like recommended chart thing to be that helpful to me, but if you want to see what charts it recommends to you, you can. In this case, this data set's very simple. So, you know, it's got some bar charts. It's pretty straightforward. Otherwise, I'm going to come in here and just grab a chart. I'm going to choose bar chart for now. And this is going to give me a little chart. It's just going to pop right up here in my sheet. And then I can kind of tweak this from here. Okay. So first thing that we're going to do is this is showing me two series of data. It's trying to show me the downloads and the number of shows. The number of shows columns are just so tiny in comparison. You can't really see them, but it's trying to show me both. I actually don't want that in my chart. I just want the chart to show the average downloads by category. So what I'm going to do is with my chart still selected, I'm going to come up to my ribbon. You'll see my ribbon has auto updated to be this chart design ribbon. And for my chart design ribbon, I'm going to grab select data. This is going to let me tweak. So it's doing the little kind of like flashing dashed line right here of the data that it selected for me, the data I had selected when I put in my chart. It's going to allow me to edit a little bit here. So the best way to look at this, these series are going to be which sort of categories of data do you have. So in this case, we can see it's trying to create two series. The orange is obviously the downloads, and by process of elimination, the blue is our number of shows. I don't want my number of shows. It doesn't make sense to show that in the same chart. So I want to remove series 1. All you got to do that is select series 1 in this list and hit the little minus button right here. That's going to get rid of our series 1. When I click OK, it's going to disappear from my chart right there. Okay. Yes, the select data. So if I've clicked on my chart in your upper ribbon there, you should see chart design. It might auto select or you might need to select it. And then once you're in chart design, you should see select data over here. For me, it's almost all the way on the right. Cool. No problem. All right, great. Okay. So I'm gonna do a couple other things, right? So I got rid of my extra series. We'll get rid of that. Okay. And then I maybe want to add some elements to my chart. Like maybe I want the actual values for each of these to be labeled on the end. All right, we'll also see now when I've clicked into my chart, it's going to give you these little floating boxes which tell you which data you have selected. So it's a good just visual check that you're actually showing the data that you want to see. All right, so I could come in here and I could say I want to put some data labels. I often use inside end. So put them up near the top. All right, so you can play with the visual design of this, but you can add all kinds of elements from up here if you want. All right, got my legend. I could say maybe I want to get rid of my legend because I don't really need it. So I can change legend here to none. I'll get rid of that thing that says series 2, clean this up a little bit. The other thing I can do here is I can, once I have my chart partly built, I can always change my chart type. So if I come up here again in my chart design ribbon, I could say, maybe I just want to like see how this looks as a pie chart. I can do that. Okay. It's also going to give you some sort of like suggested like layout formatting options in here. So it'll give you, where the legend is and how it's done some of the, like this is doing a black background for some reason or a little gradient background, right? So you can select some of these like predetermined formatting options up there as well if you want. All right, and then the last thing I would do is I would do show average downloads by category, some sort of descriptive title for my chart. All right, and here I've got my table and my chart. All right, you can imagine if I like laid these out on the page a little nicer, added a title. This could be, a report or something I copy paste to a slide deck, right? Like this is the kind of thing that we're typically creating these charts and tables. All right, any questions about how we got the table or the chart? This table is working okay, showing numbers, etc. Okay, cool. All right. So we just talked about regular charts and tables. Now we're going to talk about pivot charts and tables. Pivot tables are awesome. If you've not used a pivot table before, today is a very exciting day for you because you are going to use a pivot table for the first time and then never look back. Okay, my hat says pivot tables on it because pivot tables are awesome. All right, so pivot tables accomplish everything that we just did in way fewer clicks. Okay, so the formulas that we just did are conceptually the same thing that a pivot table is going to automatically do for you. All right, the reason I have us do the static table first is so you understand the mechanics of what a pivot table is doing sort of under the hood. It's much more flexible and much more powerful. All right, it adds a bunch of features. You can change things without having to rewrite your whole formula. A lot of good stuff. All right, so I hope everyone is excited for the most exciting part of this class. We are going to create our first pivot table, and we are going to do it to get the same result that we just did with our static tables. You can sort of see the difference. So here is how you make a pivot table. You're going to go to the source data that you want to start from. So in this case, we were using our shows tab as source data for our individual formulas, right? We were picking specific columns on here and all of that. In this case, I'm actually just going to give all of this data to my pivot table, and then I'll configure which sort of data pieces I want. So I'm going to select all the data in my shows tab. Again, the easiest way to do that is just hit one cell and do Command A or Control A to get a select all. All right. Once you have all your data selected, you're going to go to Insert in your top ribbon, and you're going to do Insert Pivot Table. All right. My Insert Pivot Table. All right, then you're going to get this little pop-up. It should be defaulting to put the pivot table in a new worksheet. If it's not, make sure you hit New Worksheet, and then you're going to hit OK. All right, now this is where the fun part starts. So whenever you create a pivot table, it's going to give you this thing on the right-hand side called a field list. All right, what is a field list? This is a list of all the columns in that source data that you gave to our pivot table when we started, right? We selected everything on the shows tab. So all these column names should look familiar to you, right? Show ID, first name, last name, right? It's all the same. And we can drag and drop from this field list to any of these 4 areas. All right, we have filters, columns, rows, and values. Most of the time, you're gonna use rows and values. All right, so I'm gonna start with those two. So if we wanna create the same table that we just created, if we wanna end up with this same result, what's the first thing in our rows? What's the first item in our rows? What piece of data? Hint. This is the column header. It's our category, right? So when we come over to our pivot table builder, we're going to find our category in our field list and we're going to drag it down, just dragging it down and dropping it into rows. All right, now in that simple drag and drop, it did that first step for me, right? We pasted the whole column. We did remove duplicates. We hit OK a bunch of times, right? This one drag and drop eliminated that step for us. Okay, this is very exciting. Now, next thing we're going to do is add our other two values. So in our previous table that we made, we did a count of shows and we did our average of downloads. So we're going to do that same thing here. Those are both values, right? So anything that we would do as a summary formula, so the average if, the count if, all that kind of stuff is going to fall into our values quadrant, if you will. So I'm going to drag and drop some things into my values. Now, in this case, for count, I could count anything that's like sort of filled in for all the shows. We were counting category in our count if formula because we were matching it. In this case, I could grab title if I want and do count of title. That's going to accomplish the same thing. All right, it's going to count however many titles are in the arts category. All right, but you could count any of these formula or any of these fields as long as they're not blank, and they'll show up here. So I'm going to drag that down. I've already, just from those two drag and drops, my 2/3 of my table that we made before is already filled in. Okay. I'm going to do one more drag and drop, but just to get that average downloads. So to do that, I'm going to grab my monthly downloads column, and I'm also going to put that in my values. All right, so I'm going to drag monthly downloads, drop it into my values. Okay. Now, the defaults may work a little differently for you. You'll notice that it defaulted when I dropped this in here to the sum of monthly downloads, right? It's adding up all the monthly downloads from that category. If I had done it that way in my demo table, I would have used a fully different formula, right? I would have used sum if here instead of average if. But in my pivot table, if I want to change this between an average and a sum, it's quite easy. I'm going to click this little I next to where it says sum of monthly downloads right here. And then I'm just going to change this little pop-up to say average. And boom, I'm going to get my average, which is pretty cool. All right, so this is the same table that we just made by handwriting all the formulas, but we made it as a pivot table in probably 10%, right? Way faster. You can do all the same stuff that we did as well. So with sorting, for pivot tables, this first column next to your row labels is going to give you a little drop down. This is where you can select all your sort options. So right now it's sorting by category alphabetically. It did that automatically for me, but I can actually now pick any of those other values that I've calculated and sort by one of those. So if I want to sort by the count of my title, and I maybe want to go descending, so show me the biggest category with the most shows first. X out of my little thing here, and it's going to give me everything here. In addition to that, it's giving me a little bit of a grand total row, which is pretty cool. I'm also getting up here in my ribbon, I'm getting some more options for my pivot table under pivot table analyze and pivot table design. All right, so design here is going to be their similar thing to the format as table, right? I can decide to make my pivot table a different color and it'll sort of automatically do the nice formatting for me. It can do things like little row dividers and stuff. So this is just a nice like little visual things. You can also turn on or off the grand total. So if you don't want that to appear here, you can toggle your grand total as well. All right, pretty cool. The last thing about pivot tables, you can do all the same number formatting as we just did before. So if I were going to use this pivot table, I would do the same number piece that we did before. I would add my 1,000 separators and remove my decimals. So pivot tables automate a lot, but they will not automate that part for you. Okay, any questions as to how we got to this? All right, cool. Another thing you can add for pivot tables is a filter. So in this case, I'm gonna add, let's see, do something that would be fun to filter by. Maybe we could filter by email as an option, right? This adds a little thing where you can come in here and filter by any specific value. Email is probably not a great option because there's not going to be a lot of the same ones in there. All right. See if we can filter out blanks, but I don't think we have any blanks. But for example, if you wanted to filter out blanks, you can do that using a filter as well. All right. And if I don't want that to appear, I can just drag it out of this, drag it back into my field list. So it's very drag and drop. It's very easy to change or add things. All right. Okay, cool. We did monthly downloads. Oh, let's do one more thing. Okay. So let's say we've got all of our shows, right? We've got 500 shows in total. And we want to know not necessarily that 62 of them are business, but what percent of our shows are business, right? Not just the raw number, but we want to know the percent. Pivot tables make that sort of thing very easy, right? You could imagine if you were over here in our static table and you wanted to know the percent of each type of shows, you need to come over here and do some sort of like formula where you grab this and then you divide it by the sum of this whole column, and then you have to paste that all the way down. Right? You have to do something like that. In your pivot table, I can come in here and I'm just going to right click on a value in this column. And then I'm going to do, once I right click, I got my little pop-up. I'm going to do show values as. I'm going to get a few options. I like percent of grand total. All right, percent of grand total is going to tell me that 12% of my shows are business, 11% are comedy, all of that. I didn't have to write a single formula. And if I want to change it back, same thing. I can just pop in there, change it back to no calculation, and it'll just go back to showing me my raw number. Okay. Cool. All right, I think we already did our sorting. Yes, we did. All right. Any questions? Wonderful. Okay, cool. So pivot charts is up next. The charts are dynamically connected to your pivot table. All right, so previously when we made our table and then we made our chart, these things are connected, right? So if I change a number here, it should change in my table once I update my data. But my pivot chart is that connection is going to be a little bit more dynamic. So same sort of benefits. It's going to be a little bit more flexible. It's going to be easier to use for data that's changing or being updated over time. All right. So we are next going to make a pivot chart from our pivot table. All right. So this is a slightly different option than the regular chart. We're going to pop into our pivot table. So I'm going to go back here. And then I'm going to come up to my insert ribbon, and you'll see if you go in your ribbon past the regular charts over here to pivot chart. All right, this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to hit pivot chart. As soon as I hit pivot chart, it's going to do a little automatic chart action for me. So this is starting off very similar to how we started last time. But you'll also notice that on the right-hand side, it's going to give you pivot chart fields that are very similar to how it was giving us pivot table. All right, so this is going to give you that same sort of drag and drop. So you don't have to do that weird like series pop-up menu that we did before for our chart. You can instead just drag and drop from here. So in this case, if I don't want count of podcast title, I can simply come in here and drag and drop it out, and boom, it's gone. And you'll also notice that as soon as I did that, it also was removed from my table. All right, so they're more dynamically connected. If I add it back, okay, let's see, I want count to my title. It's going to come back to both my chart and my table. All right, so you can sort of see some pros, cons of this, right? If you have very specific formatting that you're trying to get, some sort of more static chart like the way we did this the first time might make more sense for you. if you're kind of playing around with the data, you're adding a lot of information, it's more of a working document, this pivot chart is great. The drag and drop is super, super easy. Okay. All right, so I'm going to drag and drop this out, and I can do a lot of the same formatting stuff that I can with a regular chart. Up in my ribbon, I've got pivot chart analyze going on here. I've got my design is my other one, and then format. All right, so these are my options. Design is going to give me a lot of those same chart options I had before. So things like if I want to add some axis titles, I could do that, and I could change this. I can double click here and change this to monthly downloads. All right, and same thing, my chart. If I want to add a legend or get rid of my legend, something like this. All right, I can make all those same sorts of updates. All right. Everyone get their pivot chart to work. Success on the pivot chart. Okay, awesome. All right. Cool, we can add titles, add all these options. Great. Okay, great, yeah. So since I did not sort this before, sorry, I thought I did. As soon as I sort in my table, right, my chart is gonna sort also, which is again, a great visual. You often want your bars sorted. Largest, smallest, for example. So just from going in my pivot table up to my row labels and then changing to sort by my average downloads instead of my category name, I can get my pivot chart to sort as well. All right. Cool. All right, so let's talk about how to add or edit data in your pivot table. This is a slightly funky thing to know about Excel. If you edit any of your source data, Excel will not sort of auto update your chart until you tell it to refresh. All right, there's some situations where this is quite handy. For example, if you're sort of collecting a bunch of data and you want to sort of verify it before it goes into your chart, that'd be helpful. In other cases, it's quite annoying because you're expecting it to maybe auto update and you just forgot to hit the stupid refresh button. So kind of a pro and con, but you have to know about it. So I will show you how to do that. If you are doing this in Google Sheets, Google does not have this problem. Google automatically updates in true Google form. But let's look at an example of adding or editing some data so you can see what that looks like, right? So we're going to go back to our source data and make a very simple edit. All right, you can imagine any edit we might make to our data. But in this case, let's say we want to label one of our categories, right? We no longer want to call it technology. We just want it to show up as tech, all of our visualizations. All right, so what would we do to make that edit? I'm going to go back to my shows tab here, select my category column. I'm going to do Command F for find. All right, I'm going to essentially do a find and replace. So in my find window, I'm going to do ... replace. All right, and this is where I'm going to tell it what I want to replace my data with. All right, so what am I looking to find? I want to find the word technology. And what do I want to replace it with? This shorter phrase, tech. All right, I'm going to put that in here and hit replace all. It's going to tell me that it's done, and we made 50 replacements. Right, probably I have 50 shows in here that are in this category. I'll close this, and then I can just check. Right, this show used to say technology. It says tech, pretty straightforward. Okay, now though, if I hop over back to my pivot table, you might expect that my pivot table, being all dynamic, might have updated here to say technology or reflect any other updates that I just made. But it has not. Why has it not? Because we have not clicked refresh. So once I've clicked into my chart, I'll see my pivot table analyze option in my ribbon. All right, up in my ribbon is where I have this handy refresh button. All right, and you can either do refresh or refresh all. In this case, our chart and our table are already connected, so either should work, but if you had multiple pivot tables on this sheet, you might want to do refresh all. And as soon as I do that, it's going to update, it's going to pull in our label. And I also see, the font's a little small, but I can see my tech label on my chart as well. All right, so the moral of the story is anytime you're making edits to your source data that your pivot table and chart are drawing from, you gotta go, if you're in Excel, you gotta go manually hit this refresh button to get them to show up. All right. Any questions about our pivot table and chart situation? All right. Let's go ahead and try creating another pivot table. So if you go to your episodes data tab on your sheet, I'm gonna have you all try this one yourselves. Go ahead and select all of your episode data and insert a pivot table. I want us to find the average episode length. All right, so audio length in minutes is our column E here. All right, so make a pivot table from this data. Same steps as before, we select all of our data. And I want you to find the average length in minutes of these episodes. All right? Give you a minute to try. Who's got an average length of our episodes? I got just a little like thumbs if you got your pivot table doing that. Still working on it. Working, not working? Where we at? Doing okay? All right. What do you got? How do we get to a pivot table?
I'm still a bit lost. I was watching the previous notes about
Cool, that's okay. You got the episodes open?
yeah, I mean I was doing the I was still on the counter.
Cool, all good. All right, well, let's run through how to do this via a pivot table. So if I'm on my episodes tab and I want my average episode length, I'm going to create my pivot table. So I'm going to select all my data, my Command A. All right, I'm going to do insert pivot table. All right, usually want it in a new worksheet. And then I can drag and drop my fields. In this case, if I just want the average of everything, I can actually skip my rows part and only input a value. All right, so in this case, maybe I would drop my audio length just right over here into my values. All right, it's going to give me the single value. It's my sum of audio length. Now, last time it auto populated to a sum and switched to an average. All right, I did that by coming down here in my values. I'm going to hit my icon right here next to my values. Bigger. All right, I'm going to hit my icon here and I'm going to summarize by average instead of sum. All right, I'm going to hit OK and it's going to give me an average. It looks like just under an hour, 59 minutes is my average episode length in minutes. All right. Now I want to know what is the average audio upload length by upload date, right? So do longer episodes tend to be uploaded on certain days or not? So how would I update my pivot table to break this down by date? We have it broken down by category before. How would I do that in this pivot table setup that I have here? Yeah. Yes, I would bring it down into rows, right? So whatever I want to divvy up my data by, all I need to do is drag and drop it into my rows section. So I could try this with my upload date. All right, fantastic. So it looks like all these episodes were uploaded in February. All right, these are all February dates. And then if I look at my average, it looks like my average does vary a little bit over time, right? It looks like longer episodes on average were uploaded on February 6th and shorter episodes on average were uploaded on February 10th. Maybe it's the weekend, maybe it's the category of those shows. We don't know, but I can see that easily from my drag and drop. Right. Now, let's say I don't necessarily want to know how long they were by upload date, so I can drag upload date out of my rows, drop it back in here and back to my regular average. Maybe I want to know what show tends to have the longest episodes. How would I figure that out from here? Same thing, I'm going to divvy up my average audio length by my show ID in this case. All right, now this is a big one because I have a ton of shows, right? There's 500 shows. So all of a sudden my pivot table is going to get really long on me. If I want to figure out the largest one, I could come in here and do a sort, right? So maybe I want to sort by the average length and I'll sort descending. So which of my shows has the longest audio? Looks like it's show 262. All right. Now, this is a great example of where you might start to combine your tools, right? So I've run my pivot table. I see that this show tends to be the longest. Now, I probably don't care that it's show 262. I want to know what the title of that show is, right? I want to know which podcast we're talking about. Is this the daily? Is this something else, right? Like who has these long episodes? Probably Tim Ferriss, for being honest, right? But I want to know the name of that show. So if I go look at the source I'm pulling my data from, there's no show title here, right? There's just my episode ID, my show ID, upload date, MP3, and then the length in minutes. So if I want my show title to show up in my pivot table here, I need to get my show title to show up in my source data. And how would I get my show title to show up in my source data? I would use our very handy tool from last week, XLOOKUP, right? I would do an XLOOKUP here to bring my title in. So let's see what that might look like. I'm going to add a column in my episodes data set for title. And I'm going to do an XLOOKUP. All right, this should be starting to sound familiar. I'm going to do equals XLOOKUP. And the value I'm going to go look up in my shows table is my show ID, comma. The array, the whole column I'm going to go look it up in is my whole show ID column, A to A. My return array needs to be the same length, very good, as my lookup array. So I'm going to come in and grab here my title column, just column E for me. All right, then I'm gonna close my brackets, all right? So this is gonna go, find out that show 128 is called Decoding Noise Unplugged. Probably not a podcast I'm gonna listen to, but everyone teach their own. All right, so I'm gonna paste this all the way down. I've got my titles in here. All right, so now I wanna go back to my pivot table and I wanna remove my show ID, but I wanna have title show up there instead. All right, so I'm gonna remove show ID. I'm gonna drop it back in my field list out of my rows section, just into my field list. And then I'm gonna look for my title. However, I do not see my title showing up as an option, even though I added it as a column in my episode's source data. So what is happening? This goes back to this point, which is that if you add or edit any data in the source sheet of your pivot table, there's no automatic updating is happening. All right. So based on what we just talked about, the first thing you might try is refresh. All right, hit the refresh button, see if title shows up here. It does not. The reason it does not is because we've added a whole new column, or this might also be the case if we added rows. All right, if you're adding a column or you're adding rows, you actually need to tell the pivot table to go look in that range. Because if you remember, when we created our pivot table, we selected all of this and created our pivot table. So it's actually only looking at columns A through E and rows 1 to whatever that we gave it when we created it. So we need to tell it that actually now it should go over to column F to get that one more piece of information. So to do that, we are going to go to our pivot table analyze ribbon, and we're going to use change data source. I don't think we've clicked on this yet. This is going to show you in this classic little kind of like flashing dashed line all the data that it's looking at. So it's looking at episodes from cell A1 to E456. All right, so this giant rectangle. So we actually want to tell it that it should go to F456. All right, we want it to include column F in the possible options. So I could do two things here. I could click this little icon and I could go drag my mouse over A through F all the way down if I wanted. You're welcome to do that. In this case, since I know the specific change I'm gonna make, I'm just gonna come in here and change this E to an F. That also works. All right. I'm gonna hit OK. I'm gonna come back to my field list, and now I finally see my new option title right here. And since that's now showing up, I can drag and drop this on down. Now I'm getting my title to show up here, and I can do my same sort we're doing before. Find out that the show with the average longest episodes is Journey into Worlds Files. Which sounds like it'd be a long podcast. That makes sense. Okay, any questions about how we just added the title column to show up? All right, fabulous. Okay, let's try one more pivot table. So if you were following along at the beginning with our review of our revenue data on our campaign participation tab, you should have a column in here for downloads and a column in here for revenue. So let's do one more pivot table. We're going to select all of this data, and I want you to find out the revenue per show. All right, or revenue per campaign, up to you. You should know now that it's easy to toggle back and forth. All right, so go ahead and create a pivot table from this chunk of data, and let's figure out which show or which campaign is bringing in the most revenue. right, so how would I get my revenue in here? Same way as I created all my other pivot tables, I'm gonna select all my data. I'm gonna do insert pivot table. All right, and then I'm going to grab my revenue as my value. All right, so I have my sum of my revenue, and let's look maybe first by campaign. So maybe I'll drop in my rows as by each campaign. I dropped my revenue into my values and add campaign into my rows. All right, and then I'm just gonna sort in my row labels by sum of revenue descending, and I'm gonna find out that McDonald's campaign brought in the most revenue. If I wanted to see which show it was instead, I could just swap in my show title, swap out my campaign. If I wanted to, I could actually leave these in here and I would show a little bit of a grouping, right? So it would show under McDonald's all the specific shows that add up to this, and it'll give me this nice little subtotal of McDonald's of all of these shows that participated in that campaign. So that can be kind of a handy format as well. But if I'm summarizing, I probably want to get rid of that. And I could just do my show, same thing. I could sort descending by my revenue and find out that Whispers of Truth Forum brought in the most revenue, $36,000 across all these. All right. Any questions? In a few pivot tables, you kind of get the like drag and drop kind of idea. The other thing, this might be a better example of adding a filter than I did before. So if I wanted to add a filter, maybe I want to be able to filter by a specific campaign. So here, maybe I'll come in and already got my filter added, but let's say I actually want to use my filter. So I could come in and say, actually, I want to take the Nike campaign out of here. I just want to see the results as if Nike were not included. That's going to filter everything out and reflect in my data here. Even once I've added a filter, I can still make all my other modifications. So let's say I wanted to see the CPM per show. I could drag that in and that's still going to work with my filter. It's doing it. Sum of CPM, sum doesn't really make sense for a rate. So I probably want to think more about an average. All right, so I could see that this show, this makes sense why they have so much revenue, right? They have a bit of a higher CPM than most of these other shows. All right, so the drag and dropping is very interchangeable. I can do all this. I can get rid of my filter. That'll bring all my data back in, remove the filter. All good to go. All right, so lots of dragging and dropping action that can happen here. Cool. All right. I want to make two sort of asides. One is, we talked about this, I think, very briefly last week. I dropped some notes into our little tutorial site about how to think about AI as you're learning spreadsheets. I learned spreadsheets many, many years ago before ChatGPT. You all are learning spreadsheets in the world where ChatGPT exists. So I pasted some things in there if you're interested to sort of think about that. Things that you can do with ChatGPT or get it to write formulas for you. Even in Google Sheets, there's sort of built-in AI features. Maybe Excel has them too, and I just haven't totally figured out how to connect them. You can have them generate a formula for you, right? You can say, write me an X lookup formula that does whatever thing. And I think what I would encourage you to think about is sort of the same thing I've been saying all along, which is you don't need to memorize how every formula works. What you need to be able to do is understand for a particular formula, what types of information is it looking for, and am I giving it the right input so that I get the right output, right? You don't need to memorize these things. You can use Google or ChatGPT or whatever to help you kind of generate or remember how these things work, but you still need to be able to look at it and understand what it's doing. So an example of that, right, would be in this case, we pulled from our campaign data. We had a few different revenue columns in here, right? We had our revenue for each line, and then we had done the sort of cumulative revenue column as an exercise, right, to learn our cumulative revenue. But especially if you hadn't labeled these as clearly here, it would be quite easy for ChatGPT or whatever to making that summary table, maybe to sum up our cumulative revenue instead of our total revenue. Right, and taking a sum of our cumulative value doesn't actually make sense. Like logically, we know that that doesn't make sense, right? Because we wouldn't take another sum of a running total. But again, especially if our labels aren't that clear, ChatGPT wouldn't know that. All right, so it might just grab a revenue. If you're saying I want summary by revenue, by campaign, it might just grab that revenue. All right, so the purpose of kind of understanding what these formulas are doing and the reason that we did our whole little table here is so you can understand what the formulas are doing. And if you're generating a formula or using an assistant for a formula, you know enough to be able to look at it and know things like it should be selecting a cell here. It should have two ranges that are the same size. So the sorts of things that you want to look for to make sure that it's going to give you the result that you expect. All right. So I just wanted to kind of make that note. I don't know if that stuff is helpful or not, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Other thing I wanted to throw out there is that for next, our next session of this workshop, we are skipping next Monday. The following Monday will be sort of a dashboard session. So we'll kind of bring all of these things together and create sort of a bigger dashboard project. The week after that, October 27th, I will be teaching a SQL and Excel intro course in the same time slot, in the same room. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. Obviously, Excel is very popular. The reason I'm teaching Excel here is because I'm one of the many people who uses Excel at my job. This is just a little sort of market research chart I found of jobs that need sort of technology needs by job. Excel is by far the most common, right? Many jobs use Excel at least a little bit. But pretty soon down on this list, as far as especially thinking about technology tools at work, Python and SQL together make up a pretty sizable sum of the rest of this list. So if you're not already interested in SQL and Python, if it's not something you've already heard of, I would definitely encourage you to think about coming to those workshops. There's going to be 5 of them starting on the 27th. 2 of them will cover SQL, 2 of them will cover Python, 1 of them will sort of bring that all together. These tools are sort of the next generation up from Excel. So as you start understanding kind of how formulas work, how the logic works, how you're kind of storing your data, bringing your data together, joining it together, those are all the same concepts that we're going to be using in the SQL and Python course. They're really helpful to have both of them in your toolkit because spreadsheets are quite helpful as your data gets up to a certain size or up to a certain complexity. Maybe some of you have had the experience of trying to open a really big spreadsheet and it kind of like crashes your computer or kind of freezes. That is the moment when you can switch to one of these tools and accomplish all the same stuff that you're doing in a spreadsheet plus more with even just a little bit. So if you're a total beginner, you don't know any SQL or any Python, I encourage you to come. If you already know a little bit, you want a refresher, you're also totally welcome to come. But we just encourage you to start thinking about that. It's a really fun series. It covers a lot of the same types of things with sort of another tool set for how to do them. Great for the resume, as you can see from this chart. And that one will start October 27th. You can sign up through the Digital Lounge. Feel free to sign up for the wait list if it's full. We always have, as you can see, plenty of spots, no matter how full signups are. So just encourage you to think about that if you haven't already. And that's all I got for this week. This week is always a tiny bit shorter. So I have a little feedback survey, especially if you can't make the 4th session. Would encourage you to share any feedback that you have for me or the Digital Lounge on this workshop.
The 4th session is the week,
Is
not the next week, but the next to
the
next
20th.
week, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Yes. Session 4 of this one will be the 20th, and then the following week is the kickoff of SQL and Python the 27th. Cool. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I'll hang out up here for a little bit. If you have any questions about pivot tables or anything else, feel free to come ask. Otherwise, I will see you all in 2 weeks. Thanks so much.
So, the class in the next 2 weeks, are we like supposed to give an exam or something? How do we prepare for that?
Yeah, no exam. I mean, obviously this is